on behalf of the Indian Council of Cultural Relations to welcome the Sri Lankan Foreign Minister, Mr. Kadirgamar, who will be delivering the 30th Maulana Azad Memorial Lecture today. The Maulana Azad Memorial Lecture was instituted in 1959 in honor of the founder-president of the Indian Council of Cultural Relations, Mr. Maulana Azad. There have been very eminent speakers who have delivered this lecture, including Arnold Toynbee. The first lecture was delivered by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and thereafter a string of luminaries, including the historian Arnold Toynbee, the Nobel laureate C.V. Raman, Linus Pauling, and others have delivered this lecture. May I request the President of the Indian Council of Cultural Relations, Mr. Vasant Sathe, to introduce our speaker today, who will be speaking on the topic of Asia in the 21st century.
Mr. Kadirgamar, ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed a privilege to have such an eminent personality of not only Asia, but if I may say, the whole world, to deliver this Maulana Azad Memorial Lecture this evening. The whole concept of this lecture was to develop a better understanding among peoples of the world to build a better future for mankind. And here is an intellectual who, if I may just give a brief of his career, as a student of law, got first class first in the Ceylon University, becomes bar at law, starts practice, becomes an eminent lawyer, in international law, and of great interest to modern times is his association for nearly 12 years with the World Intellectual Property Organization. He served as director until 1988, advising all governments of developing countries in Asia and Pacific on intellectual property. Then, as a practicing lawyer, when he resumed, he specialized in commercial, administrative, intellectual property, industrial and labor, constitutional and international law. He was appointed President's Council in 1991. Ladies and gentlemen, we have not only a brilliant statesman from our region today to talk to us, because when we think of next century, which is not far out, just 5 years down, the whole human family is now concerned as to whether, while there is an exponential growth in the field of science and technology, whether mentally, intellectually, we are keeping pace with this growth. And having all the spiritual background in this region of ours, from Vedic seers, Buddha, coming down to Tagore, Mahatma Gandhi and all that, this vision, as Arvind said, of whether this Homo sapien will show the sagacity and wisdom not only to survive, but evolve higher, or whether we should, in our narrow strife, destroy the human race? This is the real question. I have no doubt that we couldn't have had a better person than Lakshman Kadirgamar to talk to us this evening. May I, sir, request you to kindly deliver your address. Thank you very much.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in 1959, Humayun Kabir, that most eminent Indian scholar, in inviting Jawaharlal Nehru to deliver the first Maulana Abul Kalam Azad lecture, said of Maulana Azad that, and I quote, "It was the love of freedom which converted that great scholar into an intrepid political fighter. It was the same love which made him an outspoken champion of rationalism and progressiveness in all spheres of Indian life. He sought to approach social, economic, and political, as well as moral and religious questions from a detached and dispassionate point of view. Freedom and equity were for him the guiding principles of life, and he sought to realize them for all sections of the Indian people, regardless of language, religion, or caste," unquote. As I commence the 1995 lecture in his honor, I wish to salute the memory of Maulana Azad, a great Indian, a great Asian, a noble human being. I also recall with some trepidation what Jawaharlal Nehru said as he opened his lecture, that first lecture, on India today and tomorrow. To endeavor to understand and describe the India of today would be the task of a brave man, he said. To say anything about tomorrow's India would verge on rashness. I ask myself, of what madness am I guilty when I seek to speak today of Asia's future? But the moment of truth has arrived. There is no turning back. I have embarked on a perilous venture. As the only incumbent foreign minister invited to deliver the Maulana Azad lecture, I am obliged to enter a caveat. The views expressed in this lecture are my own. They do not necessarily reflect the views of my government. In recent times, a body of writing has grown up around the theme of Asia's dominance of the 21st century. A plethora of books, articles, and speeches has appeared glorifying the achievements of Asia's miracle economies and predicting the demise of Western economic dominance, extolling the virtues of the Asian way of life and denigrating Western values and standards. A European writer speaks of the rise of Asia being an historic drama of epic proportions, waiting patiently in the wings for its curtain call. A Japanese writer invokes a lurid analogy. Asia's problems, he says, are the minor aches and pains of a powerful Olympian ready to compete for the gold medal, while the West's troubles are those of the out-of-shape has-been staggering to the sidelines. Some writers have posed dramatic questions. Are we witnessing a rare shift in the tectonic plates of civilization, asks one. Is Asia's growing power just an economic one, or will its value system also sweep the globe, asks another. Much of this writing is naive, exaggerated, and unrealistic. Which Asia do they have in mind? Where indeed is Asia? Asia is not a readily identifiable entity, unlike North and South America, Africa, and Europe. If those great land masses are notionally subtracted from the surface area of the globe, the rest of the planet could probably be said to be Asia, a vast terrestrial aggregation of disparate countries sprawling across the earth from Iran to China, from the Central Asian states to Australia, from North Korea to the Maldives. Countries separated from each other by vast stretches of land and water. There are peoples divided by adherence in massive numbers to every one of the great religions, philosophies, and teachings of the world. Divided again by a multitude of languages and dialects and cultures, heirs to separate histories. This grand collection of countries, large and small, does not, indeed cannot, speak with one voice. To believe that there is a voice of Asia in any meaningful sense is to pursue an illusion, a romantic dream. Those who speak of a voice of Asia, such as, for instance, Mahathir of Malaysia, Lee Kuan Yew and Mahbubani of Singapore, Ishihara and Funabashi of Japan, are really speaking for and about the countries of East and Southeast Asia. Countries whose cultural traditions could be said to be imbued with the Confucian ethic, in contradistinction to the countries of South Asia, whose cultural traditions are quite different. Those who believe that there is an East Asian voice also believe that there is a cultural tide rising in Asia. They go on to argue that as East Asia develops, there will be a reaffirmation of Asian culture, Asian traditions, and Asian values. The proponents of this view are referring, of course, to East Asia, not the whole of Asia. Lee Kuan Yew has written thus: "The 50 years since the end of World War II have seen a revival in self-confidence of the peoples of East Asia. For 300 years, the European and later the American civilizations have dominated the world. They made the scientific discoveries. They had the highest standard of living. Their arts, their lifestyles, their foods, their dress styles, their entertainment were dominant throughout the world. The problem is this: the fall of pizzas and hamburgers might well, for all one knows, signal the decline of the West. The rise of noodles and parathas to universal preeminence might well be a manifestation of East Asian self-confidence. But it is highly questionable whether any of these or similar achievements could reasonably be said to constitute a reaffirmation of Asian, even East Asian culture, traditions, and values. At best, the Asianization of the food and apparel industry will demonstrate an infinite East Asian capacity for copying the West to perfection. In truth, what is being lauded is rampant consumerism, which is a Western phenomenon of the past 50 years. One cannot send young people to the West to study and expect them to remain indifferent to the world outside when they return home. What the so-called upward mobility of the Asian middle class produces is an insatiable appetite for Western goods: cars, electrical gadgets, jeans, Walkmans, and other status symbols cherished by the Asian arriviste. Moreover, there is an inherent contradiction to create the unending flow of better goods of infinite variety and the wistful longing for a return to traditional values. In my opinion, one simply cannot have both the cornucopia and cultural purity. If unbridled consumerism is rejected or unduly controlled, modern economies will collapse. What then? The end of the Asian dream? Back to backwardness, poverty, unemployment? Asia will burst its borders and disgorge hordes of migrants who will flee to the West and overrun it. What is likely to happen in the next century, with the explosion of communications technology taking ever more complex forms, is that a standard global media culture will evolve, a mishmash of East and West, accessible to everyone, everywhere. New Asian media moguls will no doubt emerge, but they will only share the skies with the Western Murdochs and Turners and their successors. In cultural terms, what we will see is the de-Asianization, not the re-Asianization of Asia. It must be remembered that as international capital moves silently through the continents in search of greater profits, it will never be known whose hands control the great media empires of the world. In today's complex commercial environment, profit is faceless. It has no cultural identity. 40 years ago, in his speech at the concluding session of the Asian-African Conference in Bandung, Jawaharlal Nehru spoke of a new Asian spirit in the aftermath of the political liberation of its peoples. He said, I quote, "There is yet another spirit in Asia today. Asia is no longer passive. It has been passive enough in the past. It is no longer a submissive Asia. It has tolerated submissiveness too long. The Asia of today is dynamic. It is full of life. Asia might make mistakes, but they do not matter so long as she is alive. Where there is life, there is advance." I do not deny that there is again today in Asia a pervasive air of optimism and confidence, a palpable feeling wherever one goes in Asia that in the 21st century, Asia will once more rise to meet its destiny. There is no doubt that much of this feeling flows from the perception that the East and Southeast Asian countries have in recent decades performed a magnificent economic miracle of which the whole of Asia is proud. But my point is simply this. In the intricately interconnected, interdependent world of tomorrow, it would be idle to speak of Asia dominating the West. The economies of Asia are heavily dependent on. They are to a large extent underpinned by the economies of the West. In terms of capital flows, the banking system, trade, investment, the leading Asian economies are inextricably enmeshed with their counterparts in the West. The seminal centers of scientific research, the largest number of intellectual powerhouses, are presently located and are likely to remain for the foreseeable future in Europe and the United States. Asia is on a learning curve, and it will remain on that curve well into the next century. Moving away now from the cultural scene to areas of social concern, I wish to say a word about a peculiarly Asian phenomenon of the next century, the future megacities of Asia. The massive urbanization of Asia is going to cause problems of stupendous proportions in the next century. If current patterns persist, and there is little reason to doubt they will not, the ultimate shift from rural to urban will radically change the character of Asian society. United Nations predictions paint a stunning portrait of urban life in Asia. In 2010, 30 Asian cities will have populations greater than 5 million, compared with only 2 US cities and 6 in Europe. Shanghai and Bombay will each have 20 million people. Beijing, Dhaka, Jakarta, Manila, Tianjin, Calcutta, and Delhi will have more than 15 million. 7 of the 13 cities whose populations exceed 10 million will be in Asia. Tokyo, with 30 million people, will be larger than 162 countries. Some Asian cities will double in population every 10 to 15 years. By the year 2010, half of China's population will live in urban areas, up from 20% in 1994. Social and environmental costs are incalculable. Already, traffic, garbage, and smog choke many Asian cities. Unemployment and underemployment are epidemic, and there are chronic shortages of all kinds, including housing, water, power, and transportation. And yet, more cities will be created. In 1994, China created 50 new cities. In the next century, the Chinese government plans to move 440 million people, the equivalent of the combined populations of Russia and the United States, into new cities. Asia faces enormous challenges over the next few decades as it shifts from a society that is rural and agrarian to one that is urban and industrial. I apprehend 3 problems of daunting magnitude. The monster cities of the future will become black holes. They will cave in upon themselves. Civic services will disintegrate. Social order will break down. Violence will proliferate. If mega cities become unmanageable, they will be unable to provide to their inhabitants the rudiments of civilized living. What use then will booming economies be to the peoples of Asia? It is a fearful prospect. The richer countries can take corrective measures. China intends to build new towns to serve the larger cities. Haikou, the capital of Hainan Island in China's largest economic zone, is in the midst of a $9 billion facelift that will replace farms and fishing villages with an international center of light and heavy industry, trade and tourism. It will be home to 1.5 million people. Indonesia has rehabilitated 500 urban centers. Malaysia has announced plans to build a new capital city by 2008 at an estimated cost of $8 billion. The new capital will be a garden city and an information hub linked to Kuala Lumpur by a multimedia super corridor featuring the latest in satellite and fiber optic technology. In the next century, Japan will go underground. There is a project to be finished in 2020 to construct 3 large commercial areas below Tokyo, connected by underground transportation. The Taisei Corporation's Alice City project would move underground everything that need not be on the surface. This city will go 180 meters down into the ground and will be linked to similar complexes by underground transportation. But this futuristic scenario will not help most of Asia, the poorer countries, for the better part of the 21st century. The second problem is the very real prospect of exponential population growth in most of the Asian countries, completely negating the gains of economic development. If this happens to an unacceptable degree, the countries of Asia will in fact be standing still. The third problem is that because of the anticipated, and in China's case the planned, migration of rural populations to urban centers, many Asian countries will have to import the grain they once exported to the world. These imports will come from Europe and North America, where scientific and efficient methods of agriculture will continue to produce food surpluses. The political consequences of such a situation, Asia's dependence on the West for food, will be very significant indeed. I turn now to another social phenomenon, but a brighter one, that will become visible in the next century. The emergence, or to use a more popular expression, the empowerment of women, will be a notable development in Asia in the 21st century. The trend from male domination to a partnership society, where women take their place beside men in business, academia, professional pursuits, and politics, is already evident throughout Asia and gaining momentum. Women are currently represented in Asian workforces in percentages that look remarkably like Europe. In Singapore, Korea, Japan, China, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam, women number between 40 and 47% of the workforce, with Vietnam at the top with 47%. In Malaysia, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, the figure varies from 35 to 38%. While Sri Lanka is at 27% and India at 24%. These proportions must necessarily increase in the next century. The tide is flowing strongly in favor of women. Against Asian cultural norms, Asian men are slowly accepting the presence of women at work. In many Asian universities, women outnumber men. It also appears that women's traditional role as family money managers has opened doors to women in the global world of high finance. This is an area in which Asian women have achieved remarkable success. In much of Asia, women dominate the world of fund management and currency trading. In Japan, almost all currency traders are women. There is a fast-growing group of women entrepreneurs all over Asia. In Japan, there are some 2.4 million women who run their own businesses. Women are prominent in the world of fashion, the media, science and technology, increasingly in government and the civil service, and in politics. Women's emancipation is leading to a change in their lifestyles. In Japan, women are marrying at a later age, they are having children later, and some not at all. Women are initiating divorces everywhere in Asia. In China, divorce rates doubled between 1979 and 1990 and increased by 300% between 1991 and 1994, mostly among intellectual women. Unmarried mothers are on the rise in Asia. But there is another side of the picture for women in Asia, particularly in South Asia. There is still the very real world of arranged marriages at an early age, of women as chattels, of bride burnings and child prostitution. However, the emancipation of women is a tide that cannot be reversed. I am optimistic that as the new century progresses, these dark aberrations in some Asian societies will disappear. Mr. Chairman, from social issues, I move now to some key political questions. Bilateral relations between the leading Asian countries and between them and the United States will play a major part in shaping the destiny of Asia in the next century. The key players within the region will be China, Japan, India, and ASEAN. Their interactions with the United States, the European Union, and possibly Russia will be important. China's role will be crucial. The United States policy towards China betrays a degree of ambivalence, of instability, that is disturbing for the rest of Asia. Massive economic reforms have opened up China. If the liberalization of the Chinese economy is the professed goal of US policy, then one would expect that more trade and investment would be the answer. Instead, the United States threatens from time to time to derail the process by cutting off most favored nation MFN status for China. The State Department draws up its report on China's human rights record like a headmaster drawing up a pupil's annual report for its parents. This may make Americans feel good and the Chinese look small, but all of Asia is offended by such conduct and feels uneasy over its long-term consequences. The plain fact is that China's growth into a global power cannot be stopped. Perhaps it can be slowed if the United States imposes an economic embargo, but in that event it is highly unlikely that the European Union and Japan will join in such a policy. It will be a costly and futile effort. Some analysts say that even without US participation, China will have the per capita level of present-day Taiwan in about 25 years. If the US thwarts China's development, China will surely retaliate. That scenario will not be to the liking of the United States. The alternative is to engage China while it is still in the formative stages of development. Never in its long and proud history has China been more open, more willing to learn from the rest of the world, more eager to participate in the world economy, to be an active member of the World Bank, the IMF, all the UN agencies, the World Trade Organization, APEC. If China's brightest and best students are exposed to other cultures through study in the United States, Europe, and Japan, they must necessarily become less ethnocentric. With an economy open to foreign trade and investment, a new generation of educated people will emerge in China in 30 years. By then, 60 to 70% of the Chinese people will be in towns and cities. The people will travel, and the mindset of the Middle Kingdom will dissolve. The United States has to make a fundamental choice to engage or to isolate China. It cannot have it both ways. China will not yield to a stick and carrot approach. It is clear that the European Union has moved, and Japan is moving to a policy of engagement with China. They have made it clear that they will not join the United States in its annual chastisement of China's human rights record and democracy shortcomings. Fears have been expressed that China could break up as rapid growth creates imbalances between poor and wealthy provinces and between the provinces and the center. I think such fears are unfounded. There is, however, if one were to think the unthinkable, an apocalyptic scenario that predicates a dangerous rivalry between China and the United States in the next century. The scenario is that by mid-century, China will be an economic superpower with a population exceeding 1.6 billion people. What role will it wish to play on the world stage? Chinese spokesmen are at pains to emphasize that China has never been an aggressive power, has never occupied foreign territory. Tibet and Taiwan are explained as domestic affairs. The brief incursion into Vietnam and the Himalayan war with India as exercises in self-defense. But China's handling of the Spratly question and its nuclear test only a day after the extension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty sent tremors through the Southeast Asian community. From time immemorial, man has been accustomed to living in multipolar societies where power is sought and won by contest, never shared by contenders equitably between them. Professor Huntington's provocative and controversial thesis, The Clash of Civilizations, is that world politics is entering a new phase when the principal conflicts of global politics will occur between nations representing different civilizations. The fault lines between civilizations, he says, will be the battle lines of the future. A civilization is a cultural entity. Arabs, Chinese, and Westerners constitute civilizations. A civilization is defined both by common objective elements such as language, history, religion, customs, institutions, and by the subjective self-identification of people. Civilizations may involve a large number of people, as with China, which is really a civilization pretending to be a state, as Lucian Pai put it. Why will civilizations clash? Arguably, first, because differences among civilizations are not only real, they are basic. Civilizations are differentiated from each other by history, language, culture, tradition, and most important, religion. Second, because the world is becoming a smaller place. The interactions between peoples of different civilizations are increasing, and so is the friction between them, intensifying civilization consciousness. Third, because the processes of economic modernization and social change throughout the world are separating people from long-standing local identities and emphasizing their more fundamental identities and differences. Fourth, because the growth of civilization consciousness is enhanced by the role of the West. On the one hand, the West is at a peak of power. At the same time, and perhaps as a result, a rediscovery of their roots is occurring among non-Western civilizations. One hears of the Asianization of Japan, the end of the Nehru legacy and the Hinduization of India, the re-Islamization of the Middle East, and even the Russianization versus Westernization of Russia. A West at the peak of its power confronts non-Western regions that increasingly have the desire, the will, and the resources to shape the world in non-Western ways. Fifth, because increasing economic regionalization reinforces civilization consciousness. Judged by these criteria, the United States and China are firmly on opposite sides of a major fault line headed toward confrontation in the next century. As one writer has rightly observed, when Western critics write about the China threat, they mine a load filled with apprehensions and fears. The concept of the yellow peril lies much deeper in the Western psyche than reasonable people of the East and West would wish to acknowledge. But mercifully, one can confidently rule out, I would say, war between the United States and China. War between them, since they are non-contiguous neighbors with an ocean between them, can only be nuclear, and that will never happen. There is a great deal of wisdom in the world today, and there will be tomorrow, that will not permit the giants of the world to go to war against each other. I believe that nuclear restraint has now become a habit. It is the smaller fry who will jostle and contend and waste their substance on worthless conflicts. After Vietnam, it is inconceivable that the United States will ever again get embroiled in a land war in Asia. The American people will simply not allow it. Japan's role in the 21st century is also a matter of special concern for Asia. The Japanese have, with spectacular success, completed the process of rebuilding their country. Next, in the electronic global village that the world has become, Japan's role will have to be very different in the 21st century. There will have to be less emphasis on its uniqueness if it wants to be fully accepted by the international community. The West clearly wants Japan to assume a greater international role, to undertake not only economic aid to the developing world, but also peacekeeping and peacemaking duties under the auspices of the United Nations. The West is getting tired and wants to shed its burden, or at least have the Japanese share it. But Japan has to counter the fears of its neighbors, especially China, Korea, North and South, and several countries in Southeast Asia, about a recurrence of her militarism. Japan's eagerness to acquire a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council is viewed with mixed feelings in Asia. Not because Asian countries would grudge Japan a seat. They would endorse her candidature wholeheartedly as a reward for achieving economic preeminence, but because the implications of her emerging political assertiveness stir feelings of unease. Indeed, in Japan itself, surveys have shown that only 45.7% of Japanese agreed that the promotion of internationalism was Japan's duty as a major power. But 40.9% agreed that it was a necessary process for ensuring Japan's medium and long-term prosperity. As long as the US-Japan Mutual Security Treaty is valid and credible, it would be in Japan's interests and in the interests of Asia for her to remain non-nuclear. There would be friendly economic rivalry without tensions as to whether Japan or China is the dominant player in Asia. But the issue need not arise for 30 to 50 years. It will take that long for China to become a modern industrial power comparable with the Japan of today in living standards and technological capability. At the moment, it is clear that Japan has not committed itself to a policy of full engagement with China. Instead, Japan's policy is hostage to the vagaries of US policy towards China. But I am optimistic that in the next 50 years, China and Japan will become true partners. A web of links, cultural, educational, technological, and human, will be built between them. They cannot behave otherwise towards each other. For both of them, the stakes are too high to permit a breakdown in their relations. The flashpoint will come if the United States, for whatever reason, is unable or unwilling to extend intact to Japan that umbrella under the Mutual Security Treaty, or if Korea, North or South, acquires nuclear weapons. Then Japan would have to consider going nuclear. That will create tensions with China and Korea, North and South, and even the United States might have to plan for its defense against a Japan that might have a nuclear capability technologically more advanced than its own. And now I turn to India, Mr. Chairman. I think it is true to say that the whole world has welcomed India's decision at last to liberalize its economy. And the hope is universal that this decision has become irreversible. India's friends had watched in dismay as, imprisoned by socialist dogma and ensnared by bureaucratic red tape, she lost decade after decade of valuable time that could have been devoted to dynamic economic development. When compared to China, for instance, India's economic performance has been dismal. Simple comparisons for 1994 are revealing. On ownership of bicycles, by percentage of households, India had 49% to China's 81%. For color television, India had 5.7% to China's 40%. For refrigerators, India had 4.2% to China's 25%. For electric irons, India had 14% to China's 22%. The comparison of figures for average GDP annual growth, gross savings, gross domestic investment, foreign exchange resources show similar enormous differences in favor of China. I believe that the progress being made in China will have a strong impact on India. The economic ties between India and China are beginning to strengthen. Another instance of, and in part due to, the growing commercial web that is drawing all of Asia closer together. At a higher level too, China's experience is making an impact on India. Both giants were, in their modern form, born at the same time as the Cold War, and both sided with the Soviet Union against the United States in economic organization and foreign policy. Despite India's greater political affinity with America, it was China that first pushed away the Soviet Union as a geopolitical ally and then as an economic paragon. It was China that first gravitated to the East Asian model of economic development. But as the 1980s wore on into the 1990s, thoughtful Indians began speaking more and more about what the Chinese-based economies of East Asia had accomplished. And in a moment of economic crisis in 1991, India consciously began copying the spirit of what had been done to its east. An outsider trying to reckon with Asia as a whole needs to keep an eye on both China and India at the same time. One reason is sheer population. At the end of 1994, there were some 900 million Indians compared with 1.2 billion Chinese. But India's population is growing at around twice the rate of China's. And if that continues, by 2025, there will be 1.4 billion Indians compared with 1.6 billion Chinese. Together, about 35% of the world's population. Even if by then Indian incomes are still well behind Chinese incomes, India will be by far the world's second biggest market for most products. More significantly, India is a particularly useful complement to China because the two are so different. Until their economies became vastly more integrated, the business cycles of the two will continue to move as they do now, mostly independently. Moreover, India's strengths are China's weaknesses, and vice versa. China moves faster than India, but it's also more unstable. China has too little law and bureaucracy, India too much. China faces its crucial test in developing an institutional structure to sustain a modern market economy. India has that skeleton in place, but so far lacks the dynamism and market-friendly policies that have given China so much economic energy. This is not the occasion to enter into a detailed discussion of India's economic future, but suffice it to say that by the latter half of the 21st century, the prospects are high that India would have taken its rightful place on the world stage as an economic superpower. What then? What will India do with its economic might? Relations between India and China have moved into a period of tranquility. Both giants have a full domestic agenda to attend to. Will they joust again because they have a common border, unlike China and the United States? They have shown that it is possible to put border disputes aside while they attend to matters of development. If only India and Pakistan could put their disputes aside in similar fashion. I believe it will happen earlier than later in the next century, in a manner that will take the prophets of gloom by surprise. Mr. Chairman, I see no signs of any pan-Asian movement developing. The differences between the countries of Asia in size, population, economic growth, cultural values, political institutions, and systems of government are too large and too marked to permit cohesive action towards integration. There will never be a union of states in Asia. However, the 21st century will, I believe, see considerable movement in 4 areas of multilateral cooperation in which a number of Asian countries are presently involved. Mr. Chairman, in the course of the text of the speech, I have gone into some detail on what I think the 4 important regional initiatives, how they will develop in the next century. Those 4 are the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, SAARC, APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Forum, and the Indian Ocean Rim Community. Now, in the case of ASEAN, which is the most advanced of the 4 of them, having already put behind them a history of 30 years, there are very clear signs that ASEAN is developing a much more outward-looking attitude. There are very clear signs. Apart from adding 3 new countries, Burma, China, Cambodia and Laos, before too long, making their membership 10, ASEAN is definitely reaching out to the rest of the world. They are talking to other regional trading blocs, NAFTA, the European Union, and we are optimistic that in some years, ASEAN might even begin to talk to SAARC. The SAARC itself has, as you know, completed 10 years of its existence this month. And most of us who are involved in guiding the affairs of SAARC feel a very new atmosphere, a spirit of enthusiasm, a determination to move from SAPTA, the preferential trade arrangement which came into force this month, to SAFTA, the South Asian Free Trade Association. Nobody pretends or believes that this movement is going to be easy, but we have before us the examples of other blocs, particularly ASEAN, which went through all those aches and pains and made all the mistakes. They're all there for us to see and us to learn from. And we feel that is going to be a distinct advantage to us, that much of the learning time, much of the pitfall time, as some of us call it, that we would otherwise have spent in making mistakes can now be avoided. And in fact, today the Council of Foreign Ministers adopted a proposition which dictates this situation, that we will aim to have a free trade association, if possible by the year 2000, which is only 5 years away, but with very much hope for the year 2005. And steps are being taken from the commencement of the first year of the next decade to convene our research teams and think tanks and get this whole process moving. And in fact, when we met the Prime Minister of India just a little while ago, an hour ago, he too expressed a very optimistic view in regard to what South Asia is capable of doing. And I say this, Mr. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, it's very good for us to hear even statements to that effect from our leaders, because, as you know, there is so much mistrust and uncertainty and doubt about the relations of some of the countries in South Asia. The others, the smaller ones, keep on saying to the 2 big ones that they must somehow at least put aside their problem if solution is not possible in the near-term future, and let SAARC develop as an economic grouping. And what I see and what I hear and sense makes me optimistic on this score. Even today's meeting of the Council of Ministers was a very engaging, forthright, friendly, constructive meeting with no divergence in the approaches that SAARC wants to take in the next few years, and these are encouraging signs. APEC is a large body that encompasses Pacific and Asian nations. It brings the Pacific Rim countries into it. The United States and Japan, they're all in it. At the moment, there isn't a single South Asian country which is a member of APEC. APEC has a moratorium on membership up to November 1996. But it is time, surely, for the South Asian countries to assert their claim to what, after all, is a membership as of right. APEC cannot develop a fruitful relationship among themselves by leaving out the whole of South Asia. And we are hopeful that India and Pakistan, certainly Sri Lanka, intends to make an application for membership of APEC when the moratorium expires. That is going to be a trading group, and an outward-looking trading group, not an exclusive bloc. And that's the kind of organization that will help to unite Asia, albeit by interacting with other Pacific countries as well. But the more and more that the Asian countries deal with each other, transact business with each other, they will slowly develop the habit of thinking collectively and acting collectively. And I see that happening very definitely right from the early part of the next century.
May I request the Foreign Minister to take a few questions from the audience if he is willing to spare the time. I'm sure they would like to ask him some. been a very thought-provoking address. Any questions? I would request you to introduce yourselves. Maybe you would come up to the audience and speak.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Foreign Minister, you refer to Huntington's thesis, The Clash of Civilizations. I am Lakshman Kadirgamar, former Secretary External Affairs, a Nehru Fellow, and now coordinator with the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation. You refer to The Clash of Civilizations and Huntington's thesis that the 21st century might be the century of clashes across the fault lines between these civilizations. But do you subscribe to the thesis, or do you think that instead of a clash, while there would be symptoms of clashes, very largely we will see a new synthesis emerging? I think there must be an equal prospect of that synthesis coming through. There is the Indian civilization, the Chinese civilization, the Western civilization, the Middle Eastern civilization, and all that. And there are both possibilities, conflict and clash and confrontation on the one side, and harmonization and synthesis on the other. What would you foresee for the 21st century more than the other? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting point indeed. I must say that I find that Huntington's thesis is an intriguing one. I think he has rendered a service in identifying that possible problem area. His case is very well argued. There are obviously flaws in it, not everybody will agree. But I am inclined to think that he has chosen his title very well. He talks of a clash of civilizations, but falls short of open conflict. He himself argues that the conflict will not be war. That is why I say that I believe confidently that war, in the sense of all-out war, apocalyptic war, can be ruled out. Between the facts, the unfortunate thing is it's small pride who are encouraged to fight battles when they need not fight battles. They can solve their problems in other ways. And harmonizing, my view is that a great deal of this harmony will be achieved through the global media that is developing so fast all over the world. There is a tremendous explosion of technology and learning, which is going to take on fantastic aspects in the next century. That is why I am strongly of the view that the East Asian thesis is founded by Lakshman Kadirgamar, for instance, that there is going to be an aggressive Asianization of Asia merely because of food and dresses and so on are going to be the European markets is too naive. It's too simplistic. I don't think we have to like that at all. There will be a merger of all these television. You can look at Indian television today, and if you change the faces there, then you might be watching television in the United States. I think a lot of that is leading to a degree of harmony. So that is my argument, the superficial sort of harmony. I think we may have in mind deeper. I think the deeper harmony is very likely to come from a realization that war as a means of resolving big issues is out of the question. Now, for instance, take between India and China. It is a joy for all of us to see that the two giants have entered a period of tranquility in their relations. Because if they waste any more time elbowing each other on useless expressions of turf or pride or prestige, it will be a tragedy. I mean, it will be a tragedy of enormous proportions. But I think the wisdom that I feel is abundantly available in the world will take them away from that course. So I do believe that a degree of harmonization will come, but on a grand scale. Here we go beyond Asia. We are talking in global terms there.
I meant the global.
Yes, in global terms. That's my gut feeling about how things are going to evolve.
I noticed that you have not said, you have been a little on the modest side perhaps, but not spoken about our intimate neighbor, Sri Lanka, and the way it looks at its future, even before the end of this century and a little beyond. I would be very grateful if you would enlighten us on this.
Because Sri Lanka is such a small player
even in the Asian region, that it doesn't merit more than a sentence or two when one is taking an overview of the whole region. But I suspect that what you have in mind, Mr. Madhavan, is slightly more complicated. And that is something I would be very happy to talk about with a smaller group.
They are doing very well in cricket now.
Right.
Women's rights also, we congratulate.
Yes.
The President and the Prime Minister both are women, we are happy for this.
The question is being asked by the woman, the chairman of...
But I don't mention that point often for this reason. Many people take the view, and rightly so, that Asia has produced, right at the top of the pinnacle of power, political power, a number of women, 4 or 5. But South Asia, South Asia, and of course Mrs. Aquino in the Philippines, one might say. But that does not show, this is the answer, that does not show that women are in a better position as far as the rest of the spectrum is concerned. I was more interested in that. I noticed definitely a significant development as far as women's rights, not rights in the sense of an assertion of rights, but the momentum is developing. It's unstoppable, and quite rightly so. And it demonstrates beyond any shadow of a doubt that so all these decades and centuries we have lost. The economy has lost, government has lost, the whole countries have lost the valuable services of women. It's a crying shame over the centuries. So this is a very, very noticeable sign in Asia and gives me great pleasure.
We are getting into this competitive global economy. Whether like it or not, we will be forced into that type of elitist, consumerist economy. Having had the good fortune of the tradition beginning from Buddha's time, coming up to Gandhiji's time, is there any hope, Mr. Lakshman, for any new lifestyle of development on the concept of Gandhian thought, of decentralized growth, instead of forcing the rural societies of China style, as you said in your lecture, to come to the urban pockets? Is there a possibility of developing a model, according to you, with this intellectual property and all that your knowledge, of a balanced economic growth in keeping with our social concept, that the value system that we have, of reducing the wants instead of going in for more and more, that race, keeping the limit on that, although having a life good enough, but a balanced life so that we don't become exploitative. Is there any hope of developing such a model? Do you see in any discussions?
Look around, and they are looking around because television, for instance, is now so global, so universal, and they see that in other parts of the world there is a great deal of material affluence. And they begin to believe that all this is reachable. And they are told that it is reachable. And these societies, our societies, are consciously striving to get to that point. So what I foresee for a long time, a century or more, is a frantic consumerist race. With all the countries, the poorer countries, all committed within their limits, their constraints, to joining in this race. That is what I meant by the cornucopia, spilling out goods. There is a political factor also. I don't think any popularly elected government can consciously deny to its people the dream of reaching affluence or even modest affluence. They will not survive. And as for a dictatorial form of government, where we are seeing dictatorial forms of government gradually receding, so they are not going to be in a position to impose on their people a kind of more pure or modest lifestyle. In any case, they are not temperamentally suited for that kind of thing. Therefore, sad to say, but I do not see any prospect at all. And the prospect might well re-emerge many centuries later, when globally people are satiated with affluence. And there's so much materialism that you might get going back to a simpler form of life, but not now.
I just had a small question, and that was, while we may agree that the next century may not be a century of Asian dominance in the sense that it's been projected by some of the East Asian countries, are there really what you would consider, barriers so deeply entrenched that would prevent the emergence of even a vague kind of pan-Asian consciousness? Because if you look at Europe and if you look at America, the two other examples that you've given us, I think the disparities there have been equally deep. In Europe, their ethnic, linguistic, cultural differences led to two of the bloodiest wars in this century before they could come to any kind of an understanding that they would try to build a broader consensus, subsuming individual nationalisms. Similarly, in North and South America, there have been extreme disparities between countries, and even now, I mean, differences, border differences, differences in systems. Therefore, I would really like to have your view as to whether the differences in systems and the disparities in Asia are so deeply entrenched that they're worse than in America or in Europe, and these would act as kind of insurmountable barriers towards the emergence of this kind of pan-Asian consciousness.
Yes, I feel basically that Europe has one very big advantage, and that is that it is enclosed within a fairly confined area. Most European capitals are reachable, one from the other, in about 1 hour, 2 hours flying time. They also have a fair degree of cultural unity. They have been separate. They have separate languages, but the underlying cultural springs and motivations are very similar. Europe does not have something that Asia has, the vast gaps in distance, the vast stretches of distance involved. We are talking of 3, 4, 5 time zones. And that makes really for a continuation of disparity in the pan-nation sense. Understanding, collectively working together in the economic field, yes, but when you get to customs unions and common currencies and so on, look at the problems that Europe is having, even having reached this stage of integration. I think for Asia, it is so far away as to be virtually impossible.
May I thank, on behalf of ICCR, may I thank Mr. Kadirgamar for giving us such a thought-provoking address and for stimulating our thinking on the shape of Asia in the 21st century. Please join me in thanking our speaker.